The Apache woman did not come to Nate Carver's door asking for mercy like a beggar. She came like the last ember of a fire the world had tried to bury. The sun was dropping behind the broken teeth of the Mercy Ridge Hills, turning the whole valley the color of old copper, when Nate heard the horses first. Not one, not two, three riders, hard and careless, pushing their animals through the dust like men who believed the land belonged to whoever scared it most. Nate stood in the doorway of his cabin with a coffee cup in one hand and a worn Colt hanging untouched at his hip. He had not drawn that gun in 7 years. Folks in town said that made him weak. Folks in town said a lot of things when a man chose silence over powder smoke. Then she appeared out of the red haze, stumbling across the dry wash below his cabin, one hand pressed to her ribs, the other locked around a silver bracelet on her wrist. Her dress was dusty, her black hair loose from its braid, her face pale beneath the warm brown of her Apache skin. She made it halfway to his porch before her knees gave out in the dirt. Nate did not move at first. Out here, trouble often wore a human face and spoke with a wounded voice. He had learned that the hard way, with empty pockets, cold meals, and neighbors who crossed the street rather than look him in the eye. But then the woman lifted her head. Her eyes were dark and steady, not pleading exactly, but holding on to the last piece of dignity she had left. She looked at the white cowboy standing above her and whispered, "Please save me. I will meet all your needs." The words settled between them like a match dropped in straw. Nate's hand tightened around the coffee cup. Behind her, the riders crested the ridge, their silhouettes long and sharp against the dying light. One of them shouted something Nate could not make out, but the meaning carried clear enough. They were hunting her. The woman saw his hesitation and tried to push herself up, but her strength failed. The silver bracelet slipped against her wrist and caught the sunset. Nate saw the crack running through its center, saw the small feather mark etched near the clasp. His breath changed. His mother had worn a bracelet almost like that when he was a boy, before fever took her, before the town took his name and twisted it into shame. For a moment he was 8 years old again, listening to her speak of an Apache woman who had once kept her alive in a snowstorm with nothing but herbs, fire, and kindness. The riders were closer now, maybe 300 yards out. Dust rolled behind them. The woman lowered her eyes, as if she already knew what most men would choose. Nate stepped down from the porch, slow as dusk, and set the coffee cup on the rail. He did not touch his gun. He only bent, offered her his hand, and said, "Ma'am, whatever debt you think you owe, it don't start tonight. Tonight, you breathe." Nate lifted the Apache woman with the care of a man, carrying something already broken by the world, but not willing to let it break further. She was lighter than he expected, though the tension in her shoulders told him she had learned not to trust gentle hands. The cabin door groaned open, and the smell of pine smoke, saddle leather, and black coffee met them in the dim room. He set her in the chair nearest the stove, then crossed to the far wall and pulled up the loose plank beside the flour barrel. Beneath it waited a narrow root cellar, dug years before by a man who thought winter was the only thing worth preparing for. Nate looked back at her. No questions now. "Can you climb down?" She nodded once, proud even with dust on her face and fear moving behind her eyes like a shadow underwater. He helped her to the opening without touching more than he needed to. Before she lowered herself into the dark, the silver bracelet tapped against the floorboard. That small sound carried through the cabin sharper than any church bell. Nate shut the plank above her, scattered a burlap sack across it, and had just enough time to hang an old horse blanket over the Apache shawl near the stove before the riders reached his yard. They pulled up hard, horses blowing, spurs ringing, dust curling around the porch steps. The tallest rider swung down first, a narrow man with polished boots too clean for honest trail work. Nate knew him by sight. Harlan Pike, a bounty runner who smiled like every word in his mouth had been bought secondhand. Pike stopped at the edge of the porch and looked Nate over. "Evening, Carver. You seen a native woman come through here?" Nate opened the door wider, letting yellow lamplight spill across the boards. "Seen a lot of dust. Wind has been busy." Pike's eyes moved past him, searching the cabin. The other two men stayed mounted, hands low, faces blank beneath their hats. There was no law badge on any of them, only rope, rifles, and the confidence of men who expected poor folks to step aside. Pike sniffed the air and smiled. "Funny thing, We found tracks leading straight this way. Small tracks. Woman tracks. Nate leaned one shoulder against the frame. Then your eyes are better than mine. I stopped studying the ground once it quit paying me. Pike took one step up onto the porch. Folks in Mercy Ridge say you have a soft spot for Apache trouble. Nate's face did not change. Folks in Mercy Ridge also say rain is coming when their knees ache. That does not make them prophets. One of the mounted men laughed under his breath. Pike did not. His gaze caught on the second tin cup sitting near the stove. Nate saw it at the same moment. 2 cups. 1 man. A silence opened wide enough to fall into. Pike pointed with his chin. Expecting company? Nate crossed the room, picked up the cup, and tossed the cold coffee through the open doorway into the dirt. My horse drinks from that one when he gets proud. The lie was plain. Maybe too plain. But Nate told it like a man too tired to care whether fools believed him. Beneath the floor, Tala White Feather held her breath in the dark, one hand over the cracked bracelet, hearing every word pass above her like boots on a grave lid. Pike stared at Nate for a long time, then smiled again, thinner now. Judge Bell wants that woman brought in before morning. Says she carries stolen property and a false story. Nate looked toward the hills, where the last light was dying clean and red. Judge Bell always did have a powerful fear of stories he did not write himself. Pike's smile vanished. For a heartbeat, Mercy Ridge seemed to hold its breath with the woman under the floor, the cowboy in the doorway, and the 3 riders deciding whether one quiet man was worth the trouble. Pike was the first to look away, and that told Nate more than any confession could have. Men who came with lawful business did not mind silence. Men with dirty errands hated it. Pike stepped back off the porch, smoothing the front of his coat as though dignity could be brushed clean. We will be back, Carver, before sunup. And when we come, Judge Bell will not be asking friendly. Nate gave him the kind of nod a man gives whether he cannot stop. Then I reckon I ought to sleep light. The riders turned their horses toward Mercy Ridge, but they did not ride fast. They drifted away slow, looking over their shoulders, letting their threat hang behind them like dust that refused to settle. Nate waited until the last hoofbeat faded beyond the dry wash. Then he waited longer. Out here, impatience could get a person buried in somebody else's trouble. Only when the night insects began singing again did he lift the burlap sack and pull up the loose plank. Tala White Feather did not climb out right away. She looked up from the dark with her hand still closed around the bracelet. Her face calm now. Too calm. The kind of calm that came after fear had burned through all its noise. They are gone, Nate said. For now. She rose carefully, accepting his hand only for balance, not rescue, and that small difference did not escape him. In the lamplight, he saw how young she was, younger than the weight in her eyes. He set a clean basin on the table, filled it from the pump bucket, and placed a folded cloth beside it. Then he turned his back to give her privacy and busied himself at the stove. Beans, cornbread, and coffee. Poor man's supper, but it was hot. For a while, neither of them spoke. The cabin held the little sounds of survival, water dripping into the basin, fire shifting in the stove, a spoon touching tin. Tala finally said, "You did not ask what I meant." Nate looked over his shoulder. About what? My words outside. About meeting your needs. The room changed. Not in a loud way. Just enough for the firelight to seem softer and the air to grow careful. Nate turned back to the stove. A person says many things when fear is close. She shook her head. I said what I meant. Among my mother's people, when a life is saved, the one who is saved carries a debt. Work, food, shelter, protection, whatever is honorable, until the debt is balanced. Nate brought 2 plates to the table and set one before her. Then you can start by eating. She stared at the plate as if kindness might be a trap with better manners. I can mend your clothes, tend your horse, keep your house, guard your door. Nate sat across from her, slow and plain. Miss White Feather, a life is not a bill I collect. Her eyes lifted. You know my name? Pike said Judge Bell wanted a native woman. The bracelet told me the rest. Tala's fingers tightened over the cracked silver. You know this mark? Nate's gaze dropped to the little feather etched near the clasp. My mother wore one like it. She said an Apache woman put it on her wrist the night I was born, up north near a pass where the snow came waist deep and the soldiers had turned away. Tala went still. The fire made a small sound between them. My mother helped a white woman in a storm, she whispered. She told me the child lived. Nate did not answer at once. He looked at the bracelet, then at Tala, and something old moved through the cabin, older than Mercy Ridge, older than all the names men had used to divide the land. At last he said, "Seems your mother already paid any debt between our houses." Tala looked down at the food, and for the first time since she had crossed his yard, her shoulders loosened. Outside, the moon rose over the hills like a pale witness. Inside, two strangers sat at one table, joined by a kindness neither of them had been alive enough to remember, and by a danger that would arrive before morning. The night did not deepen all at once. It gathered in layers, first along the fence line, then beneath the cottonwoods, then in the corners of Nate Carver's cabin where the lamplight could not quite reach. Tala ate slowly, not because she lacked hunger, but because trust came harder than bread. Nate pretended not to notice. He stepped outside once to check the yard, then came back with his coat smelling of cold dust and horse sweat. Mercy Ridge sat 4 miles east beyond a crooked line of mesquite and dry gullies. But even from there, trouble had a way of finding the weakest door. This time it had found his. Tala set her fork down and loosened the cracked silver bracelet from her wrist. Her fingers moved carefully, almost reverently, as if the thing were not metal but bone. "Judge Bell believes I do not know what I carry," she said. Nate sat across from her, elbows on the table, the fire laying gold across the old scars on his knuckles. "And do you?" She turned the bracelet in her palm until the little feather mark faced him. "A government rider came to our camp 3 nights ago. His name was Thomas Greer. He was tired, sick with fever, and afraid of men wearing better coats than his. He said the paper inside this bracelet could keep my people on our land through winter." Nate looked at the crack in the silver. "Inside it?" Tala nodded. "My father once said white men trust paper more than memory, so he told me to carry both. My people remember the treaty. Judge Bell hopes the paper has vanished." Nate reached for the bracelet, then stopped short of touching it. "May I?" Tala watched his hand for a long second before placing it on the table between them. Not in his palm. Between them. That mattered. Nate picked up his pocket knife, the same dull little blade he used for rope and apple peel, and held it near the bracelet without opening the seam. "If this paper is real, Bell will not want it reaching Fort Union. He will not want it reaching anywhere," Tala said. "His railroad men have already marked our grazing ground with stakes. They say the hills are empty." She looked toward the window, where her reflection floated over the dark glass. "They call a place empty when they do not wish to see who is standing there." Nate said nothing. There were words a man could answer, and words he could only sit beside. From the shelf above the stove, he took down an old leather pouch. Inside were 3 things he had kept through hunger, shame, and winters mean enough to. Crack water buckets, his mother's faded ribbon, a tin photograph of her face, and a small scrap of blue cloth sewn with the same feather mark. He laid the cloth beside the bracelet. Tala's breath caught, quiet but sharp. "My mother's stitching," she whispered. Nate looked at the floor, then back at her. "Mine called her Morning Star. Said she had hands steady enough to calm a storm." Tala touched the blue cloth with 2 fingers, and for one brief moment the hunted woman disappeared. In her place sat a daughter hearing her mother's name honored in a stranger's house. Outside, an owl called from the ridge. Farther off, a horse answered with a low, restless sound. Nate rose and crossed to the window. A lantern blinked once in the distance, then vanished. Not a star, not a house light, a signal. He lowered the curtain. Tala stood, already reaching for the bracelet. "They are watching?" Nate took his hat from the peg by the door. "Maybe. Or maybe they want us to think they are. Either way, we cannot wait for morning." Tala's eyes hardened, but her voice stayed low. "Where will we go?" Nate looked toward the black line of hills west of the cabin, where an old freight road cut through gullies most town men were too proud to remember. There is a church ruin 2 miles past Widow Creek. From there, an old trail runs north. If we make it before moonset, we can reach Elias Crane by dawn. She knew the name. The army clerk? The man who knows government seals? Nate nodded once. "If that paper is what you say it is, he will know." Tala slipped the bracelet back onto her wrist. The silver looked small against the weight it carried. Nate opened the door, and cold night air moved through the cabin like a warning. He paused only long enough to take the blue cloth and fold it into his vest pocket. Then he looked at Tala, not as a burden, not as a debt, but as a person standing at the edge of a truth too dangerous to carry alone. "Stay close," he said. "Not behind me. Beside me, Nate and Tala left the cabin without taking the front trail. That was the trail expected by men who thought in straight lines. Nate led her behind the stable, past the rain barrel, through a stand of mesquite, where dry thorns scratched softly against their sleeves. His bay horse, Juniper, waited saddled in the shadows, patient as old wood. Nate checked the cinch by touch, then offered Tala the stirrup. She looked at him once, measuring whether the gesture carried command or respect. It carried neither, only urgency. She mounted first, and Nate swung up behind her with enough distance to keep the night honest. The horse moved west at a careful walk, hooves finding the hard ground between patches of loose gravel. Behind them, the cabin sat dark and quiet, a little square of silence under the moon. Then a lantern flared near the dry wash. Another answered from the ridge. Tala felt Nate go still. They were already there. Not close enough to stop them, but close enough to prove the trap had been laid before Pike ever rode away. Nate leaned toward the horse's ear and whispered, "Easy, girl." Juniper slipped down into a narrow cattle cut, where the walls rose shoulder-high on both sides. Dust smelled different there, colder, mixed with sage and old rain trapped deep under stone. For nearly half a mile, no one spoke. The only sound was leather shifting, breath moving, and the small silver bracelet tapping once against Tala's wrist whenever the horse stepped down over rock. That tiny sound worried Nate more than hoofbeats. It was a bell for anyone listening. He reined in beneath an overhang and took a strip of cloth from his pocket. "May I?" Tala understood before he finished. She held out her wrist. He wrapped the bracelet carefully, not hiding it from shame, but quieting it for survival. His fingers never lingered. When he was done, she said, "You treat even metal with manners." Nate gave a low breath that was almost a laugh. "My mother said manners are what a man has left when he has nothing else." Tala looked ahead into the dark cut of the ravine. "Your mother must have been strong." "She was kind," Nate said. "Took me years to learn that was stronger." The trail bent north near Widow Creek, where the water had dried to a silver thread under cottonwood roots. On the far bank stood the church ruin, black against the stars, its steeple broken off by a storm long before Nate was born. He guided Juniper inside the roofless shell and dismounted. Moonlight poured through empty window frames, laying pale bars across the dirt floor. Tala slid down after him and stood near the old altar stone, listening. Nothing. That was what made it wrong. No coyotes. No insects. No wind in the grass. Nate crossed to the rear wall, where a loose pile of stones hid the mouth of an old freight trail. Before he could move the first stone, a voice rose from outside, smooth as polished bone. "Carver, you always did know the forgotten roads." Judge Amos Bell stepped into the moonlit doorway with Harlan Pike at his side and two riders behind him. Bell wore a black coat, clean gloves, and a town man's calm, as if the night itself had been summoned by his order. Tala did not step back. Nate did not reach for his gun. Bell smiled at them both. "Miss Whitefeather, you have caused this county considerable distress." Tala lifted her chin. "Truth often troubles thieves." Pike shifted, but Bell raised one gloved hand, and the whole ruin seemed to obey. Nate looked from the judge to the dark beyond the doorway. For men visible, maybe more outside. Bell's eyes moved to Tala's wrapped wrist. "There it is," he said softly. "The little trinket everyone is suffering over." He turned to Nate with a sadness so false it barely wore a face. "Hand it over, son. Walk away clean. By breakfast, Mercy Ridge will remember you as a reasonable white man." Nate stood in the broken church with dust on his boots and moonlight on his hat brim. For a second, the offer hung there, tempting not because it was good, but because it was easy. Then Nate reached into his vest pocket and touched the blue cloth sewn by Tala's mother. His voice came low. "Judge, I spent 7 years being remembered wrong. One more morning will not scare me." Judge Bell let the silence sit, because men like him trusted silence only when they owned the room. But the old church did not belong to him. It belonged to weather, dust, forgotten prayers, and the moon looking down through the missing roof. Nate stood near the rear wall with Tala beside him, close enough that he could hear her breathing, steady. Now, not because she was unafraid, but because she had decided fear would not speak for her. Bell removed one glove finger by finger. "You disappoint me, Carver. A man in your position ought to understand opportunity." Nate kept his hands where everyone could see them. I understand opportunity fine. It is what dishonest men call temptation when they want it to sound respectable. Pike made a small sound in his throat, half warning, half anger, but Bell only smiled. He turned his attention to Tala. My dear, whatever that dying courier told you, he misunderstood his own orders. That bracelet contains property of the territorial court. Give it to me, and I may persuade the town to show mercy. Tala looked at the judge as if he were a snake behind glass. Mercy is not yours to lend. Bell's eyes cooled. No, but the gallows and Mercy Ridge are. The word moved through the church ruin and made the night seem colder. Nate felt the old instinct rise in him, the one that knew the weight of iron and the speed of regret. His hand did not move. He had promised himself long ago that if justice ever came near him again, he would not mistake it for a trigger. Bell stepped closer. Think carefully. By sunrise, I can have this woman named a thief, a spy, and a danger to every family in town. The people will believe it because fear is easier to feed than truth. Nate glanced at Tala's wrapped wrist. Then he looked past Bell, toward the doorway where the two riders stood too straight, trying not to listen too hard. That was when he saw it. A nervous flicker in the younger rider's face. Not guilt exactly. Recognition. Nate spoke to him instead of the judge. You rode courier once, did you not? The young man blinked. Pike snapped, keep quiet. Nate kept his eyes on the rider. Fort Union route, maybe. You know a government seal when you see one. Bell's jaw tightened, just a little. Small thing. Enough. Tala understood. Slowly, she unwrapped the cloth from her bracelet and held out her wrist, not to Bell, but to the young rider. The cracked silver shone in the moonlight. The feather mark rested beside the seam. The rider swallowed. I have seen that mark on treaty packets, he said before fear could stop him. Bell turned on him with a look sharp enough to cut rope. The rider dropped his gaze, but the words were already loose in the air. Nate took one step forward. Judge, you said it was court property. Funny thing for a court to hide inside Apache silver. Bell's face did not change, but the calm around him thinned. He reached for the bracelet. Tala pulled her hand back. Not from fear. From refusal. Bell looked at Pike. Take it. Pike moved, but Nate placed himself between them, empty-handed, quiet, impossible to hurry. There was no shove, no strike, no gunfire. Only one man standing where another man expected a gap. Pike stopped because men like him understood violence, but did not know what to do with dignity. Then, from beyond the ruined wall, came the soft creak of a wagon wheel. Everyone froze. A lantern glow appeared on the old freight trail. Slow, steady, honest. Nate allowed himself one breath. Elias Crane had come early. The old army clerk rode in sitting stiff on a mule cart, wrapped in a gray blanket, with spectacles low on his nose and a ledger box beside him. He looked at the judge, then at Nate, then at Tala's bracelet. His voice was thin but carried like a church bell. Amos Bell, step away from that woman. I know the seal you are trying to bury. Elias Crane climbed down from the mule cart with the slow care of an old man whose bones had been arguing with him for years. No one helped him. No one dared. He carried the ledger box in both hands, and the little brass lock on it flashed under the moon like a quiet eye. Judge Bell watched him cross the broken church floor, and for the first time that night, his polished calm looked borrowed. Crane set the box on the old altar stone. I was told you were sick in bed, Bell said. Crane adjusted his spectacles. I was. Then a boy came to my window and said Nathaniel Carver was riding with an Apache woman and half the county's shame behind him. Felt like a poor night to keep sleeping. Nate looked toward the doorway and saw the young rider lower his eyes. So that was the nervous face. Not courage yet, maybe, but the beginning of it. Crane opened the ledger box and removed a flat bundle wrapped in oilcloth. His fingers trembled, but not his voice. 3 winters ago, I filed a copy of the Red Willow Creek Treaty Extension. It protected Apache grazing land from rail purchase until a federal review could be completed. Judge Bell objected to the filing. Loudly, Bell gave a dry laugh. Old papers and old memories. Neither one proves what is hidden in that bracelet. Then let us make it less hidden, Crane said. He looked at Tala. Ma'am, with your permission. Tala stood beneath the open roof, moonlight resting on her black hair and the silver at her wrist. She removed the bracelet and placed it in Crane's hands. Not between them this time. In his hands. Trust, when it finally came, did not make a sound. Crane took Nate's pocket knife, found the seam in the cracked silver, and worked it open with the patience of a man untying a prayer. Inside lay a strip of folded paper, dry, thin, and sealed with red wax pressed flat from years of hiding. The feather mark was there. So was the territorial stamp. The church seemed to grow smaller around it. Crane held it close to the lantern. His eyes moved line by line. No one spoke. Even Pike looked away from Judge Bell, as if distance might save him from choosing sides. At last Crane turned the paper outward. This is the original field order, signed by Captain Monroe, witnessed by Thomas Greer, and countersigned in my hand. It states that no railroad survey, private claim, or county court order may remove the Red Willow Apache from that valley. He looked at Bell over the top of his spectacles. You knew it. Bell's mouth tightened. That document is incomplete. It is stolen. It is inconvenient, Crane said. There is a difference. Tala closed her eyes for one breath, not in weakness, but because the truth had finally been spoken in a white man's room by a white man's law, and still it carried her people's memory inside it. Nate saw her hand open at her side. Empty now, but no longer powerless. Bell turned toward the riders. We are leaving. Pike hesitated. Judge, if that paper is real, then maybe we ought to let the marshal sort it proper. Bell stared at him. The kind of stare that had bought obedience for years. But something had shifted. Not much. Enough. The young rider stepped away from the doorway. Pike did too. A path opened where there had been a wall. Nate did not smile. Men did not become honest all at once. Sometimes they only stopped moving in the wrong direction. Crane folded the paper back into the oilcloth and placed it in Tala's hands. By first light, he said, we ride to Mercy Ridge and read this before the whole town. Bell's eyes moved from Tala to Nate. You think one paper will change them? Nate looked past him to the paling edge of the eastern sky. No, but it will make them choose what kind of people they want to be while everybody is watching. Bell had no answer for that. Outside, the first thin color of morning touched the hills. And in that ruined church, with dust underfoot and a treaty in her hands, Tala White Feather stood taller than every man who had tried to make her small. Morning came to Mercy Ridge pale and reluctant, as if even the sun was not eager to look upon what men had done in the name of order. Word traveled faster than the mule cart. By the time Nate, Tala, Elias Crane, and the others reached the main street, half the town had gathered outside the courthouse, boots in the dust, shawls pulled tight, coffee growing cold in forgotten cups. Judge Bell rode ahead of them with his back straight and his face arranged into the shape of innocence. Men like him understood crowds. He knew where to stand, when to lift a hand, how to let fear do most of the talking before he ever opened his mouth. Tala walked beside Nate, not behind him, the folded treaty held in both hands. Some people stared at her as if she were the danger. Others stared at Nate as if he had finally proved every ugly whisper they had ever spent on him. A woman near the mercantile pulled her child closer. An old ranch hand spat into the street and looked away. Nate saw it all. He carried each look without giving one back. Elias Crane climbed the courthouse steps with the ledger box tucked under his arm. His mule waited at the hitching post, ears flicking at flies. Sheriff Darden stood near the door, pale. Under his hat, caught between the judge who signed his pay and the truth standing in front of him. Bell turned to the crowd. Good people of Mercy Ridge, this matter concerns stolen court property and a dangerous falsehood spread by those who do not respect our laws. His voice was smooth, warm, practiced, the kind of voice that could make a locked door sound like shelter. Before fear could harden into agreement, Elias Crane stepped forward. I served 12 years recording federal orders, land claims, treaty copies, and military seals. My hands are old, but they still know ink from mud. The crowd quieted, not out of respect alone, out of curiosity. Curiosity was a crack in any wall. Crane unfolded the treaty and held it up so the red seal caught the morning light. This document is lawful. It protects Red Willow Creek from railroad purchase, private sale, or county seizure until federal review. Thomas Greer died trying to deliver it. Tala White Feather carried it because no one else would. A murmur moved through the town like wind through dry corn. Bell laughed once. A thin sound. You expect these people to trust an Apache woman over their own judge? Nate stepped onto the bottom stair. No, he said. I expect them to trust what you were afraid to let them see. He reached into his vest and took out the blue cloth with the feather stitch. My mother carried this until the day she died. An Apache woman saved her life before I ever took my first breath. Some of you called that shame when you heard it. I reckon that says more about Mercy Ridge than it ever said about my mother. No one moved. Even the horses seemed still. Tala looked at him then, and whatever passed between them had no need for a name. Sheriff Darden took the treaty from Crane and examined the seal. His hands shook, but he did not hand it back to Bell. "Judge," he said quietly, "this needs to go to the marshal at Fort Union." Bell's face changed by only a little, but enough for everyone to see the mask slip. Pike stepped down from his horse and removed his hat. The young rider did the same. Then, from the west end of town, another silence arrived. 50 Apache riders stood along the ridge beyond Mercy Ridge. Still as carved cedar, their horses lined against the morning. They carried no threat, no shout, no raised weapon, only presence. The crowd turned and saw them, saw restraint where they had expected rage, saw dignity where they had been taught to imagine danger. Tala lifted her chin, the treaty held against her heart. And Mercy Ridge, for the first time in a long while, had nothing clever to say. The Apache riders did not enter Mercy Ridge. They waited on the ridge line with the patience of people who had survived longer than any town's opinion. Their stillness did more than 100 angry words could have done. It gave the crowd nowhere to hide from its own imagination. Sheriff Darden folded the treaty with both hands and tucked it into his coat, as if the paper had suddenly grown heavier than his badge. Judge Bell started to speak, but the sheriff turned toward him first. "Amos, until the marshal reviews this, you will step away from the bench." Bell looked at the faces below him, searching for the old obedience, the easy fear, the nods that had carried him through every crooked morning. He found only dust, lowered eyes, and people beginning to understand how cheaply they had sold their judgment. Harlan Pike stood near his horse with his hat against his chest. The young rider beside him would not look at the judge at all. That was how power left a man like Bell. Not in a shout, not in chains. In the quiet moment when people stopped moving aside. Tala White Feather descended the courthouse steps. The crowd parted for her, slowly at first, then with shame making room where kindness should have stood sooner. The woman from the mercantile who had pulled her child close now lowered her gaze. An old ranch hand removed his hat. No apology came. Maybe words were still too far away. But silence, this time, was not hatred. It was learning. Nate waited beside Juniper at the edge of the street. He had no victory in his face. Only the tired calm of a man who had carried a hard thing as far as he could and found it had not broken him. Tala stopped before him. For a while, neither spoke. Around them, Mercy Ridge listened with the discomfort of people who knew they were not meant to hear everything. Elias Crane cleared his throat and pretended to fuss with his ledger box. Sheriff Darden pretended to study the treaty seal. Even the wind seemed to step softly. Tala reached into her hair and drew out a single white feather tied with a thin strip of red thread. She fastened it to the strap of Nate's saddle, her fingers steady, her face unreadable except to a man who had spent one long night learning how little a face needed to say. Nate looked at the feather, then at her. "I thought your debt was settled," he said. "It is," she answered. "This is not debt." "Then what is it?" Tala glanced toward the western ridge, where her people waited under the morning sun. A reminder. Of what? Her eyes returned to his, dark and calm as deep water. That a man can be alone for so long he forgets he is allowed to be needed. The words found a place in him no bullet ever could have reached. Nate lowered his eyes for a moment, not from shame, but from the weight of being seen without being judged. When he looked up again, Tala had already stepped back. Her people rode down just far enough for her to join them. No one rushed. No one celebrated. The treaty would still need carrying. The marshal would still need convincing. The railroad would not stop wanting. But that morning, the lie had lost its first piece of ground. Tala mounted a gray horse near the edge of town. Before she turned west, she looked back once. Nate touched the white feather on his saddle strap. It moved lightly in the breeze, small as a promise and strong as a prayer. Mercy Ridge watched the Apache riders disappear into the gold wash of morning. Long after the last horse had crossed the ridge, nobody spoke above a whisper. And Nate Carver, who had spent 7 years being remembered wrong, rode home under a cleaner sky, carrying no reward but a strip of feather, a mother's old story made whole, and the quiet knowledge that justice when it finally comes, does not always sound like thunder. Sometimes it sounds like a town holding its breath while one woman rides